It's good to see all of you. Again, if you weren't here earlier, my name is Tyler. I'm the student and worship music pastor here at Life Change. And so this morning I'm going to be kind of jumping in and teaching a little bit. But before I do that, I just wanted to take just a second and just kind of say kind of to Jim and to his father who's here today that we are all thinking about you guys. We know you guys have been going through a lot of ups and downs in the past couple weeks, and you probably will be for the next couple of weeks. But we just want to continue to pray for you guys and continue to support you guys. And I think that's something that's true for maybe more people in this room than just Jim, right? I think there's probably a lot of people in here that are going through your own ups and downs right now, right? But I think one of the beauties of church, one of the beauties of having a church family is that we're here to support each other, right? We're here to be there for each other. And I know you guys already do an amazing job at this, but I just want to continue to encourage us to continue supporting each other, continue being there for each other, continuing just being somebody to listen to, right? And so we're going to jump into this new series today. This new series is going to be called Samson, which, if you couldn't guess by the title, is about Samson, all right? So Samson is not, I don't think he's really the most famous person in the Bible, but if you've been around church for a while, you've probably heard at least a few things about him. So can anybody tell me, what is Samson most known for? I heard somebody say, yeah, hair and strength, right? Yeah, absolutely. So I think those are definitely the things that he's most known for, is his hair and then his strength, right? Because Samson was a strong man. He was a big, strong man. He was pretty much the strongest man in the Bible. He was basically a superhero with the incredible strength that he had. And I don't know this for sure. I'm just kind of assuming here. I'm assuming Jim asked me to start this series because... right? I don't think I need to say it. I think it's pretty obvious. So Samson was a big, burly dude, just like me, who accomplished incredible feats. He did incredible things, like, for instance, literally ripping a lion apart. At one point, he defeats 1,000 men all by himself. Okay? So this guy is strong. But what I think sometimes gets lost in the story of Samson, we kind of get into this mindset that this is a superhero story, right? But the reality is Samson and the book of Judges that we're going to be looking at through this series is actually a tragedy. It's actually a really sad tragedy. And so, in spite of his incredible strength, Samson was a deeply flawed human being. Yeah, he was a deeply flawed person. He was selfish, he was arrogant, and he was constantly making bad decisions. And while I wish I could say that muscles was the only thing I had in common with him, the reality is I can probably relate even more to the fact that Samson was selfish, arrogant, and was constantly making bad decisions. And I think we could probably all say that is true, right? And so today's message is actually titled, Strength is Weakness. Strength is weakness. Because Samson had a ton of strength. He did. He had a ton of strength. But Samson's trust in his own strength was actually his biggest weakness. Thankfully, in spite of Samson's weakness, God still chose to work through him. And he still did incredible things and accomplished his purposes through Samson. So let's dive in here and let's really kind of break down Samson's story. To really understand Samson's story, we first kind of need to understand what's going on in history at this point. Because I could just jump in, I could just start telling you all about Samson, but you'd be missing a lot of information, a lot of really important things about Samson. So let's kind of set the stage here, all right? So Samson lived in the Old Testament times. This was over 1,000 years before Jesus comes on the scene, all right? So this is before Jesus' ministry on earth. This is before Jesus dies on the cross. This is 1,000 years before that. And last week, if you guys were here, we know Jesus came to die for our sins, right? He came to save us, right? And so Jim was kind of sharing the bridge illustration, and he shared how every one of us from the very beginning of time have sinned and turned our backs on God, right? But thankfully, God, instead of just giving up on us and wiping us out, which, I mean, honestly, he really had every right to do, right? instead of doing that, God still loved us and he wanted to make a way back for us. He wanted to give us forgiveness so that we could live with him again. So we see early on that God chooses to make a promise to a man named Abram, who then gets renamed Abraham after this. He chooses Abraham as this person who he's going to work through, and basically his descendants are going to lead to Jesus, okay? And most of the Bible is centered around Abraham and his family. Now, this family grows and grows and grows, of course, and eventually it becomes a whole nation, and they become known as the Israelites. So, God chooses to work through Abraham's family, the Israelites, but just to be clear, I kind of want to get this out of the way up front. It was not because Abraham or his family were perfect. Not at all, exactly. In fact, you can kind of go back and you can read through some of the Old Testament, and you'll find out pretty quick, they're a hot mess. All right? They are a complete hot mess. I think people that maybe don't know a lot about the Bible or just haven't had a chance to read it yet kind of have this picture of all these Bible heroes, right? These people that have done awesome, amazing things, and they were great people, and then God worked through them, and they did even more awesome things, right? That's partly true, but the reality is if you read through just the first couple pages of the Bible, you'll find out again just how messed up they are right away. In fact, I would go so far as to say if the Bible was rated, or if the Bible was a movie, it would be rated R, right? I mean, again, for those of you that have read through a lot of it, it would absolutely be rated R for all the violence, the sexuality, all the terrible things that mankind has done throughout history. Now, obviously, there was a lot of good as well, right, when they were following Jesus, and that's the key. So, all right, let's get back to Abraham. So after Abraham dies, several generations go by, and like I said, they become this huge nation called Israel, but Israel finds themselves as slaves in Egypt. All right? They found themselves as slaves in Egypt, and God has pity on them, so he does these incredible miracles, miracle after miracle, and leads them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and gives them their own land. He gives them this place that's going to be their home. There's only one problem. The problem is there are people already living there, and the people already living there are really bad people, really terrible people, like child sacrificing bad, okay? And so God, again, shows up, cares for his people, and does amazing things by defeating these people that were living there and allowing the Israelites to move into their new home. And they lived happily ever after. For a very short time. Right. So, you see, the Israelites moved into this land, but they didn't exactly drive out all those bad, evil people. They didn't drive them out like they should have. Instead, they kind of just ended up letting them stay and hang out. And that comes back to bite them in a big way. And that's what Judges and Samson's story is a big part of. A big part of that is in Samson's story. So, all right, so that brings us to the time of Samson in the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges starts off by listing all these nations that the Israelites should have driven out of the land but didn't. And then in chapter 2, we come to this, all right? So if you want to go ahead and put this verse up on the side screens, it says, "The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal." It was another false god, right? And so they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. As I said, that happily ever after was very short. And so at this point, God, as it says, is angry, and he lets the Israelites be defeated. He's like, fine, if you want to live with these other nations, these other evil people that are influencing you in terrible ways, go ahead. And he lets those nations defeat the Israelites and rule over them. So the Israelites are, of course, as a result of that, in distress. So God has pity on them again, and he chooses a hero who the Bible calls a judge, all right? So these judges are really heroes, to work through to save the Israelites and free them again. Awesome, right? So the Israelites are probably super thankful, right? They're probably super thankful. They feel bad about the things they've done and want to change everything about what they've been doing, right? Well, we pick up a few verses later, and it says this. It says, whenever the Lord raised up a judge over Israel, he was with that judge and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. For the Lord took pity on his people, who were burdened by oppression and suffering. And then we get to verse 19. But when the judge died, the people returned to their corrupt ways, behaving worse than those who had lived before them. Gosh dang it. They keep ruining this happily ever after. And so this is the cycle that we see over and over again throughout the book of Judges until we finally get to the last judge that we read about, whose name is Samson. All right? All right, so I know that was a lot of history, a lot of context, and if you don't like history, maybe you kind of glazed out. So let me give you the cliff notes here, all right? Basically, what ended up happening was God loved us and wanted to live with us, and we turned our back on him. Okay, God saves us and wants to live with us. We turn our back on him. God saves us again and wants to live with us, and we turn our back on him. It just keeps going, right? It's this downward spiral. It's this downward spiral that eventually leads to Samson and the story that we're focusing on. All right, so when we first hear about Samson, God has actually handed the Israelites over to one of those nations called the Philistines, all right? He's handed them over to the Philistines. So let's finally take a look. Let's meet Samson. Samson, I think, perfectly embodies everything that we've learned so far about the Israelites, all right? For better and for worse. He starts out amazingly, all right? He starts out amazingly. In fact, God actually announces the birth of Samson to his parents and gives them special instructions. That only happens a few times throughout the Bible. It's very rare that God shows up and announces a birth and then gives instructions for it. But Samson is one of those few. And so Samson is told to take a special vow called a Nazirite vow, all right? And this vow basically meant that he was supposed to do three things, all right? First off was never touch a dead body. Cool, I can do that, right? Number two, never drink any kind of alcohol or even eat grapes, okay? All right, that might be a little bit harder. And number three, never cut your hair, okay? So just to kind of sum that up, no dead bodies, no alcohol, no mullets, right? Party in the front and the back, am I right? Okay. So this vow wasn't like a common thing that everybody did, and we're not expected to do it today. But basically, it was meant to be an outward symbol of an inner devotion to God, right? An outward symbol of an inner devotion, and it's the exact same thing as like a wedding ring, right? This is an outward symbol of an inner devotion between a man and a wife, right? Okay, so I've set the stage. The Bible says Samson grows up, and we finally get to meet him. We finally get to meet him and hear him speak. So let's see who this Israelite judge is, this hero that's going to deliver God's nation. First things he says. Let's see here. He first speaks in Judges 14:2, and it says here, when he returned home, he told his father and mother, a young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me. Oh, no. Okay, first off, the obvious issue, right? The first obvious issue is get her for me. Probably not the most romantic proposal I've ever heard. Hopefully that's not how any of you were proposed to, so get her for me, right? But, okay, let's keep reading. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Let's keep reading. Maybe there's some depth to this relationship that we just haven't heard about yet, right? Maybe? So his parents object to the marriage, and then Samson defends it by saying this. It says, but Samson told his father, get her for me. She looks good to me. Whew, okay. So this guy, Samson, this is the one that's going to be saving the entire nation of Israel? This is the guy that God's choosing to work through? Him? He asks his parents to marry some girl that he's never met, who's from a corrupt and wicked nation, right? We talked about that. And his justification for it is, she looks good to me. Samson, you're giving guys a bad name, right? Like, stop, just stop. So reading that, it can seem downright bizarre that God is choosing to work through that guy. But if we're being honest, right? If we're being honest, I think Samson is a little more relatable for us than we might think at first. All right, and I'll explain why. I think he's actually a little more relatable than we might think. See, at the beginning I said Samson's trust in his own strength was his biggest weakness, right? And I think that's still true for us today. That's always been true. And right off the bat, we see that what's Samson doing? Samson is trusting his own wants and desires over anything else, right? He's trusting his own wants and desires above everything else. He's thinking one thing, right? And this brings us to our first point. One thing, he's thinking, I want it, right? And that's what he's obsessed with. I want it. I want it. And for guys, that mindset can play out just like it does for Samson. We might not say, get her for me, right? We might not say that. But when we let our wants and our desires and our eyes become more important than anything else, what inevitably ends up happening, right? We end up destroying our life. We end up destroying our relationships, our marriages even. We end up destroying basically the lives of the people around us, right? I think that's an extremely common and relatable version of I want it. But there are plenty of other ways that I want it plays out in our lives. I want it can look like I want that promotion. I want the money. I want the house. I want the new car. I want the dream wedding. I want all these things, right? And we get so focused in on these things that we forget silly little things like logic and wisdom and morality even, right? And we get so focused in on I want it, we forget everything else. Our trust in our own strength, again, becomes our weakness. And when we let I want it take over our lives, it can lead further into the weakness, and that I want it becomes I deserve it, right? I deserve it. So let's get back to Samson and see what we're talking about here. So Samson is determined to marry this Philistine woman so basically he and his parents go over to meet her, all right? Basically go over and meet her and maybe set up this wedding. And along the way, something very strange happens. Samson gets attacked by a lion. All right, Samson gets attacked by a lion. I know I say that and you guys are all just kind of sitting there like, oh, okay, yeah. But really think about this for a second. He gets attacked by a lion, okay? And I'm not talking about like a cute little Simba. We're talking like a mighty, fierce Mufasa, right? Okay? So it says, we go back to verse 6 here, and it says, at that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. Now, that's the Samson I know, right? That's the Samson we want to believe in, taking down a lion with his bare hands. So this big crazy thing, this crazy miracle really happens, and afterward, it's really anticlimactic. Samson just kind of goes on his way. That's all it is. In fact, he doesn't even tell anybody that it happens. Are you kidding me? Like, if I took down a lion barehanded, I would be telling every single person I ever met for the rest of my life. But he doesn't. I guess it's just another day in the park for him. So he goes on, and he ends up setting up this wedding with the Philistine woman, and that's that. And so we pick up again in verse 8, all right? We find out that some time has passed. It says later, when he returned to Timnah for the wedding, so they've already kind of done a lot of the planning, right? It says he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion. It's been sitting there rotting, right? He turns off to look at the carcass of the lion, and he found that a swarm of bees had made some honey in the carcass. No, it gets worse. Verse 9, he scooped some of the honey into his hands and ate it along the way. Gross. He also gave some to his father and mother, and they ate it. Double gross. But he didn't tell them that he had taken the honey from the corpse or the carcass of the lion. Okay, first off, this is so gross. This is so gross. How mad would you be if somebody gave you some food, you ate it, and then later on you found out, oh, by the way, I found that in a dead possum on the side of the road earlier. Not cool. Yeah, right? Ugh. But the grossness actually isn't the worst part of this. The grossness isn't the worst part of this. It's bad, but it's not the worst part of this. What were the three things that Samson vowed to never do? It was no alcohol, right? No mullets, and no dead bodies, right? Don't touch dead things. I think the key part of this story is when it says he turned off the path, right? He turned off the path to go look at his victory. That's what he did, right? You can just feel the sense of entitlement building up in him. He's not really thinking just, I want it anymore. He's really thinking, I deserve it, right? I deserve it. I've earned it. And so Samson does something incredibly gross, grabs this honey out of a dead carcass, and he betrays God over a handful of honey. He betrays God over a handful of honey. Who would be dumb enough to betray God over a tiny little handful of honey? Yeah, the answer is me, right? The answer is me. I would be dumb enough, and I'm betting I'm not alone in this, right? How often do we turn our backs on God over something small, insignificant, that we're going to forget about in a day, right? It starts with us thinking, I want it, and that becomes, I deserve it. And if we continue down this path, it leads to the last one. I can handle it. I can handle it, right? And this is, on its own, it's the strongest sounding phrase out of all of them, right? I can handle it. I can handle anything. I can take whatever it is. I can handle it, right? But the reality is that phrase, I can handle it, is the weakest phrase by far. It's the weakest phrase by far. Again, the title of this message was Strength is Weakness, right? So let's pick it back up here, and I'll explain what I mean. See, as they're planning the wedding, we pick back up in verse 10, and it says, as his father was making the final arrangements for the marriage, Samson threw a party at Timnah, as was the custom for elite young men. Now, I was looking it up this week. This word for party in the original Hebrew language that this was written in, this word party has kind of two definitions. It's feast and drink. Feast and drink, all right? Now, I want to be clear here. The scripture here does not say that Samson drank. It does not say that, okay? And so it's entirely possible that he held up his vow and he did what he was supposed to. But he threw this party and he put himself in a bad situation, didn't he? He put himself in a bad situation where he would be tempted to break his vow and drink. And even if he was able to have self-control, which up to this point in the story, it doesn't really sound like he has a lot of self-control, but even if he did, he still, like I said, he placed himself in a tempting situation. And we're going to see as we go through the rest of this series in the next month or so, we'll see that this isn't going to be the last time that he puts himself in a bad situation. And time again, it ends up biting him in the butt, all right? So again, it starts with I want it, it becomes I deserve it, and then that ends up leading to the final downward spiral of I can handle it, I can handle it. So again, this morning, I'm just wanting to kind of start this series for us and set the stage for what we're going to be talking about throughout this series. And I wanted to help us understand why Samson and the Israelites' story is so important for us still today. And I think the answer is because it's an incredibly relatable story, right? I think it's easy to get caught up in all the craziness of somebody who's super strong, a superhero basically, right? And get caught up in pulling honey out of a dead carcass. But at its core, this story, I think, is incredibly relatable. But don't worry, even though this story of Israelites and the Samsons is a tragedy, as I said at the beginning, that's what it is. I'm not going to leave you with that today, all right? So we can end on a bit of an upper note, all right? I want to take a look at the lessons we can learn from Samson and figure out how we can live differently, all right? So just to recap, our strength becomes weakness when we buy into this downward spiral of I want it, I deserve it, I can handle it, right? I want it, I deserve it, I can handle it. And that's what we're sold every single day in this advertiser's dream, consumerist culture that we live in. I mean, right? And I say that about our time, but it's nothing new. It's nothing new. Humans have always wanted to buy into the mindset of, I want it, I deserve it, I can handle it, right? We've always wanted to live that way. That's what we want. And as a result, our strength always ends up becoming weakness. But the whole purpose of God choosing to work through Abraham and through these messy Israelites and then bringing Jesus to this earth, the whole point was Jesus showed us something better, something more true than strength is weakness, and that is that weakness is strength, okay? Weakness is strength. See, instead of I want it, our focus needs to become I need God. Instead of I want it, it should become I need God. And that's not easy. That's not easy. For many of us, our needs aren't something that I think we think about too much, right? Now, I know some of us may struggle and may have things, but I think for a lot of us, it's easy to take for granted something like running water and food and shelter, right? When we're lucky enough to have those things all around us, we don't have to think about our needs, right? And so when we don't have to think about our needs, what do we tend to drift to? Our wants. Exactly. We go from our needs to our wants, and we start thinking about what we want. And again, in this culture that we live in, it's built around wants, right? It's built around you can get what you want. But there's a basic need that we need to be focusing on every day. Our need for God is critical. It's where everything has to start, right? Understanding that we have this need for God. And I'm going to take it a step further. I think it even goes beyond the, kind of classic answers to this, right? Like reading the Bible and praying. Those are incredibly important. Singing songs, right? All these things are incredibly important. I'm not saying they aren't. But it goes beyond that even, right? Our need for God and our need to be with God and work as God's instrument, right? It goes beyond just those things. It's every part of our life, right? Every single day. We need to choose to live every single part of our lives for God every day. This is the way that we interact with people, right? The way we talk, the way we act, the way we think, the way we even take care of ourselves, the way we even relax. All of these things are part of our lives, right? And we need to learn how to live all these things out for God. It's not easy, but it is critical. It is. And so we'll continue on here. Instead of I want it, it needs to become I need God. And the second phrase in this weakness is strength is instead of I deserve it, we need to understand that I don't deserve anything. And in fact, to take it a step further, I deserve death. I deserve death. I have tried so many times in my life to try and cut myself off from God. I've tried so many times to cut myself off from other people. I've hurt God, right? I've hurt other people. I've hurt the people closest to me. I've hurt myself, right? And the Bible is very clear that the punishment for evil is death, or the way that the Bible says it is, the wages of sin are death, right? What we have earned for sin is death. For this hurt that we've caused in other people, the wages for that is death. And no matter what I believe or want to believe, no matter what I'm being told, the reality is I'm incredibly lucky and blessed to be breathing, right? I'm incredibly blessed to be breathing right now. And the fact that God doesn't just want me to be breathing, but he wants me to have a meaningful, purposeful, peaceful, fulfilled life on top of that is actually downright not fair, right? If you think about it, it's actually downright not fair. It's completely not fair. And that's why we say God is love, because he loves me when no one should love me, right? God loves me when no one should love me. God did amazing things through Samson, in spite of Samson, right? He did amazing things through Samson in spite of Samson. God did amazing things through Samson with Samson fighting him every step of the way. Now imagine what God can do through us when we're not fighting him, but instead we become somebody that doesn't trust in our own strength, but instead trusts in our weakness and let our weakness become our strength. What could he do through somebody like that, right? And my last point is this. Instead of the I can handle it, we need to understand that I can't handle anything alone, right? I can't handle anything alone. The reality is that's the weakest sounding statement. Like if you just said that to somebody on the street, that would sound incredibly weak, right? To say that I can't handle anything on my own. But I'm going to try and make the point that it's actually the strongest idea you can live by, the strongest phrase. Because God gave us each other for a reason, right? We're not just on this earth by ourselves. We are meant to live for and with each other, right? And for God, of course. And so I've said this, before. The church is not the building. Church is not this service right now. It's not this hour that we have together. The church goes beyond that, right? The church is every day. The church is us, right? The church is us. And so we are the church, and we need to support each other. We need to care for each other, be there for each other, find out what's going on in each other's lives so that we can then be there to support each other. And so this is kind of my big challenge for us this week, all right? This is my big challenge. I've kind of got 2 questions that I wanted to end with. And you can pick whichever question you want to kind of be your question for this week, all right? I don't have them up on the side screens, but I just want you to hear them and think about them, all right? So here's the first one is, what are my weaknesses, and how can I be more honest about them? What are my weaknesses, and how can I be more honest about them? Maybe that means honest with myself. Maybe it means honest with others. And the second question is, what am I trying to carry on my own that I can't carry on my own? So think about those 2 questions. I'll repeat them here, all right? Think about these 2 questions and which one maybe you need to take this week and meditate on. Think about what are you going to be thinking about as you go to sleep tonight, all right? So here, I'll read them again. What are my weaknesses, and how can I be more honest about them? And then the second question is, what am I trying to carry on my own that I can't carry on my own? All right? We need to be there for each other. And again, I said at the beginning, you guys do an amazing job at that. In fact, I would say you guys probably do probably one of the best jobs I've ever seen at that at a church. But I want to encourage us and challenge us to not stop, right? Continue being there for each other, continue supporting each other, because that's one of the key missions that we have as a church. And the other mission, of course, is to go out and change the world, right? And to bring others in to this relationship with God. But once we're in, we need to continue doing this, right? We need to continue supporting each other and being there for each other.